I'm Jay Shamba. I'm the director of the Institute for International Economic Policy, or IIEP, here at George Washington University. And I'd like to welcome you virtually to Washington, D.C. right now. We at IIEP are very pleased to be co-hosting this event on accelerating systemic change, a case study from Wales, an installment in our Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy series, and to once again be partnering with the Thunderbird School. For those of you who don't know us, IIEP is located at the Elliott School at George Washington and is a cross-school interdisciplinary research center. We aim to serve as a catalyst for high-quality, multidisciplinary research on policy issues surrounding economic globalization. It's a mandate we interpret quite broadly and support research and policy work in areas ranging from trade to international finance to development to poverty studies to climate change and to economic policy more broadly. We've been rather busy lately hosting a number of events virtually and on whether inequality or China's economy, India's economy, and our Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy series. Please take a look at our website to see more details, or our YouTube channel where you can find prior events. So without further ado, I'd like to again welcome you here to DC virtually and now turn it over to Anne Florini from the Thunderbird School of Management at Arizona State.
Jay, thank you so much, and welcome to everybody, morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you're watching this. My name is Anne Florini. I teach at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, which is part of Arizona State University. And I want to welcome you on behalf of the school and the university, and then say a note to a particular note to a few of the people who are watching this, who are enrolled in a program that is trying to teach people to do exactly the kind of thing that we are talking about in today's webinar. Thunderbird is not your usual school of management. It is one that has, from the beginning in the 1940s, been focused on larger questions of how to bring peace through commerce, through international exchanges of all kinds. It was founded by people who came back from World War II and said, we can never let anything like that happen again. So the school has always had an underlying ethos of cross-cultural communication, languages, understanding. It draws people not only from the business sector, but from government and civil society as well. A few years ago, Thunderbird joined with Arizona State University. So Thunderbird has been for many years ranked the #1 school of global management in the world. Arizona State University has been ranked as the most innovative university in the US for many years. So this was a very happy meeting of minds. Thunderbird is based in Arizona, but has hubs all over the world. It's very much of a global institution. Its very innovative curriculum of late has started to take into account things that don't really happen in most other institutions to try to understand, how do we manage complex problems? How do we understand the broader uncertainties of the 21st century and give people new sets of skills and tools that enable them to manage under extreme uncertainty? In particular, in Washington, we have an Executive Master of Arts in Global Affairs and Management. And I'd like to say just a word to the students from that program who are watching today and the alumni. You will recognize underlying strands of many of the things that we've been addressing: understanding complexity and how to manage under conditions of extreme complexity, understanding networks, breaking down silos. All of these are the kinds of skills that we believe are the things that people really need to know how to do and that very rarely get taught. So I'm very grateful to the speakers today, the North Star Transition Lab, for giving us such a compelling real-world example of deeply skilled practitioners taking on a truly new way of doing things. It is a perfect fit with everything that we've been trying to do. And I also want to extend my thanks to our co-host at the Institute of International Economic Policy at George Washington University. It's been a pleasure doing all these webinars with you, and I look forward to more. And with that, let me turn it over to today's moderator, Sunil Sharma.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Jay. And let me add my welcome to everybody. Today, this is the 10th seminar in the series on Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy, and we are glad to have it co-sponsored by ASU Thunderbird, which has been a partner in 8 joint events. The Rethinking Capitalism and Democracy series was started in the middle of the COVID pandemic to address systemic issues. To me, the dialogues that I've had with the North Star Transition team have been intriguing because their Wales project provides a real-life example of an effort to improve well-being at scale by transforming the food and health system in tandem with improved nature preservation. The Wales Transition Lab is attempting to rewire, in many ways, the food, farming, environment, water, business, education, and health services sector across Wales. As we know, systemic problems are characterized by complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity, with a dizzying range of information gaps, feedback loops, path dependencies, time lags between cause and effect, and tipping points. Systemic also means that the issues are embedded in larger societal processes, and there's a need to identify, assess, and manage interdependencies and spillovers across actors, sectors, and geographies. The seminar will examine the ways in which the Wales Transition Lab is helping to bring about a systemic transformation and the challenges it faces. With that, let me introduce the speakers. Jyoti Banerjee is co-founder of North Star Transition and project director of the team that created the integrated reporting movement globally. He chaired the Integrated Thinking and Strategy Group, a collaboration of over 50 global organizations, including the World Bank, the BASF, and Novo Nordisk. He's been a tech entrepreneur for 2 decades, and at North Star Transition leads the Finance Transition Lab. Jyoti has a master's degree in economics from Delhi School of Economics, also an institution that I attended, and an MBA from Open Business School. He has taught entrepreneurship at Oxford Side Business School. And in a sheer coincidence, it so happens that we are from the same high school in New Delhi, St. Columba's, 5 years apart. Jenny Scott is a founder partner at Apella, an advisory firm that helps organizations build their purpose, strategy, and reputation. Prior to establishing Apella, Jenny was an executive director at the Bank of England, responsible for leading communications throughout the 2008 financial crisis and the Brexit referendum. She was also co-head of strategy. Before that, Jenny was economics correspondent at the BBC. She is a trustee of Pro Bono Economics and a senior advisor at North Star Transition. Victoria Topham is a chartered accountant who worked for over 20 years as a finance professional, training with PwC and holding commercial and corporate finance roles with leading media industry businesses. She works with businesses and organizations to develop purpose-led business models, which are getting a lot of attention today. Victoria leads the Wales Transition Lab and is also vice chair of the Buckinghamshire Food Partnership. Victoria has a geology degree from the University of Durham, a business sustainability management qualification from the University of Cambridge's Institute of Sustainability Leadership, and a professional coaching certificate from the Henley Business School. She's a qualified member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland. With that, let me offer the floor to Jyoti, Jenny, and Victoria, but let me start with a question. We have 3 people here with very, very diverse backgrounds, and it is just, it would be a little, I think, interesting for the participants to know how the 3 of you came together for this project. With that, the floor is yours.
Well, Sunil and Anne, thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this event. You said that it's a bit of a coincidence that we were from the same school, and perhaps it's not such a coincidence that Jenny and I are from the same church in Twickenham in England. And so we've known each other, I imagine now probably close to 20 years. Victoria is someone I got to know rather more recently as I started investigating regenerative ideas, how systems can be changed. And Victoria turned out to be a fellow traveler on this journey. And so that's how the 3 of us connected. But there's a team of 12 of us who are collaborating on North Star Transition. We're a baby organization. So just as your webinar started during the pandemic, we started during the pandemic as well. And Wales Transition Lab is only a year old. So I heard some very generous things being said about what we've done in Wales from Anne. And I would temper that by saying you can't do systemic change in 1 year. and we're 1 year old in terms of Wales Transition Lab, but it's still exciting to be part of this journey and for us to be learning together. Okay, I'm sharing my slide, and I just want to check that you folks can see it.
Yes.
Okay. Super. All right. So Anne and Sunil, thank you very much for the invitation to take part in today's webinar. We have titled this Accelerating Systemic Transformation. And by talking about systemic transformation, we are very clearly wanting to put our flag in the place of seeing how an entire system shifts. We're not just about seeing change taking in one corner of the system. And in order to help carry out that kind of change, we are exploring why change needs to happen at all. That's kind of the starting point. And if you look at why North Star transition started in the first instance, it's because we were looking at the world in which we live. And as you look around, you can see a climate emergency. You can see a biodiversity emergency. You can see an inequalities emergency. And as a result, there are literally thousands of initiatives around the world that are seeking to deal with each one of those emergencies. Last week, I was over in Glasgow and attending some of the COP26 events. And it was amazing to see the range and the diversity of the ideas that people are working on. But I guess if you step back and ask the question, how is humanity doing? What are humanity's KPIs looking like at the moment? Perhaps the answer is not so good, because despite these thousands of initiatives, we're still in a place where carbon is getting worse every single day. We're still in a place where biodiversity is getting worse. We're losing more and more of it every single day. We're still in a place where inequalities are becoming more and more extreme. And so if that's the situation, what can we do about it? And I guess for us, North Star Transition was created as a way of saying that the existing initiatives, they're all needed, and yet somehow they're not delivering the goods. Is there something else that's needed to be done? Is there another way of doing this? And I don't want to pretend for the first moment that what we're doing is going to finally be the world's solution to all these problems. But we want to try another route. We want to see if there is another way of seeking systemic change. And to seek systemic change is really to explore how the entire system works, and then wonder, where can you create change that allows change to happen elsewhere? So you're not just interested in change in one corner of the system, you're interested in change across multiple corners of the system that can align together and enable a whole new configuration for the system. So how do you even begin to start on this kind of journey? Well, I'm not a systems change expert by any means. I've, as Sunil's generous introduction, I've been involved in all sorts of different activities. But the thing that really concerned me about even attempting to understand how a system works is every bit seems connected to every other bit. So is there a way to start? And I decided that the place I knew the least about was food. And it wasn't long before I realized that actually, when you look at food, you touch on biodiversity, you also touch on energy use and the distribution of that food and retail and so on and so on and so on. And before you know it, you're touching all different parts of the system. And so really, I saw food as a new portal for me to look into the working of the system. And I went out to speak to farmers just because I'd never done that in my life. I eat food every day, like I imagine all of you do. And yet I was one of those who knew very little about where the food came from, how the system of food worked, who the growers were, who they interacted with, Where were the failures and disconnects in the system? And I met people like Bob Quinn from Montana in the US and Charles Hunter Smart in the UK. And these are farmers who have moved away from industrial farming methods because those farming methods had left their farms bereft of organic material and the ability to be productive. And as a result of trying to solve those shortages in organic material, they ended up trying to use chemicals to help fix their problems. The costs of these chemicals and the other inputs they were using were so high that actually their farms were on their knees. And instead they migrated from being the kind of industrial farmers that they were into what today some people call organic or agroecological or regenerative or whatever. And so they started on a journey to do that. And they're in a place where their farms are amazingly viable now, and they've made huge impacts in terms of environmental qualities in their farms, etc. And I just thought, wow, that's a great idea. I assume loads of farmers must be following in their footsteps. And the crazy answer is that in the UK, only 2% of farmers are doing that kind of stuff. 98% of them are not. So then the question became, why would you not want to do it? If it transforms the organic potential of your farm, if it transforms your financial opportunity, why would you not want to do it? While talking to the farmers, I started engaging with environmentalists who were saying to me, these farmers have destroyed biodiversity across the land. And especially when I was talking to environmentalists in Wales, because Wales is, it's not where I live, but it's not far. It's about 150 miles to the Welsh border from where I live on the edge of London. And out there, the environmentalists were saying the farmers in Wales had destroyed biodiversity across the land. And the environmentalists had come up with plans to build a biodiversity spine across the center of Wales. And their idea was, let's just connect farms together so that biodiversity can thrive again. But when you go and talk to the farmers, they think, well, what's in it for us? Because the plans that the environmentalists have don't include us. In fact, they'd rather we weren't there. But that land is our land. What are we supposed to do? So I started exploring how the farmers and the environmentalists were engaging with each other, and learned that actually farmers had a much more serious problem that they were facing compared to just a few environmentalists coming to try and grab their land. Instead, what they were facing was economic decline, because the UK is in a situation where it is shifting across to new trade agreements that it needs to carry out in order to replace the big trade agreement that it had with the European Union. And that is now lost, and therefore they're seeking new trade agreements, and they're seeking these at any cost, including buying food from countries that are willing to supply them cheap food, even if it damages the local farmers. And so the farmers were really concerned about trade deals being done with Australia and New Zealand and potentially America, which could really put their farms in jeopardy. And so I thought, fine, I'll go and talk to people in Westminster and Whitehall, the centers of power in the UK political scene. And the answers I got from them when I asked them, are you paying attention to how your trade deals are going to impact UK farmers? The answer was, I hope you're not trying to save these Welsh farmers, because really they're not competitive. We can buy cheap food elsewhere. So maybe you should just let this be. And my thing was, how could it make sense that it's all right to buy cheap food elsewhere, transport it across the world? Aren't we trying to meet environmental goals? And the glib answer I got was that, yeah, of course, we can meet our environmental goals by losing a few farmers and buying sheep from New Zealand, because the sheep from New Zealand and the emissions thereof are New Zealand's problem, not ours. And I said, what about shipping them across the land? Well, global shipping is nobody's emissions, and therefore there's a straightforward way of doing this. So once I heard this story, and no matter how likely it was to happen, I wanted to go and test it out. So I went and talked to friends in the water industry to say, is that okay? If we lose some farms, do you care? And they were like, we can't lose the farms, except if we lose the farms, we can only lose them if we replace them with forests. Because if we don't do that, we're just going to lose the ability for the soil to hold water. And therefore, we'll end up with flooding downstream. And I asked my friends in insurance, how do you feel about the fact that maybe 10 years from now, we'd have lost a bunch of Welsh farms, and now we're going to have flooding in the cities, in the lower catchment areas? And the insurance companies were saying, why do we have to be the guys to pay the bills for those sort of decisions? And I was speaking to the health people to say, are you comfortable with the idea that we're going to be buying, let's say, chlorinated chicken from America? People seem concerned about it. Is it a health problem? And they said, no idea. If it's not to do with nutrition, the health service is not involved in food issues. And I was just hearing all these different conversations and thinking, why aren't these conversations connected with each other? And so as a result, we came up with a method for how we thought we could bring together these multiple conversations that seemed so disconnected from each other. And we came up with 4 big ideas that we thought were absolutely essential in order to create social tipping points. And the first of them is that we have to bring together a diverse group of stakeholders. Most stakeholders who operate in one corner of a system have never spoken to or connected with someone from another corner of the system. The health people, for example, have no connection whatsoever to the farmers. And yet, in the health system, they spend £500 million a year on diabetes issues caused by the fact that people across the population of Wales are eating poorly. The food that they eat lacks the nutrient qualities it needs to have, bad lifestyle practices, and yet the health professionals have no understanding of how to change the number. All they know is that next year, even though 2/3 of that 500 million is avoidable because it's type 2 diabetes, next year, the number that they will spend will be higher because every year the number is higher. There's just no connection between these different stakeholders to explore how they can address these problems. So bring diverse stakeholders together, help them to learn with each other, help them to listen to each other. That's so important. And we worked with University College London as our partner organization. They have a climate action unit that is focused on helping groups of people connect with each other who have never connected before, so that they can hear each other, listen to each other. And once that's happened, you can then start to seek emergent practice. What is it that we can do that we never even thought we could do? No one had ever imagined it before, but now that we've got our diverse groups together and we're exploring how the system works, maybe there's another way we can do it. And once we've worked out what these emergent practices are, we can then ask the question, what sort of method can we use to nurture those new ideas so that they're not just little pilot ideas in one corner of the system, but how do we help them grow to mature so that they would be credible alternatives to the way the system currently runs? So we think nurturing communities of practice is really important. And then it's not enough that we should nurture a community of practice. We need to scale it up so that these different communities of practice may collaborate together and we get a transition across the system. So that was our starting idea for how we might do it. What did we do? Well, my colleague Victoria is going to go into more detail about how we constructed the participation in what we call Wales Transition Lab. So Wales Transition Lab is a grouping of people from food, from farming, from environmental, health, education, business, finance, insurance, all these sectors collaborating together. And we have over 35 organizations now from different corners of Wales who are collaborating. And what we wanted them to do was to listen to each other so that they understand what they where the failures in the system are, how they understand the perspectives each of them have on what they could do. And then we invited them to collaborate on constructing some ambitions for the Welsh system. If we could reconfigure the working of food, health, and nature across Wales, how would we, what would we want to see in those ambitions? And we came up with 4 ambitions across the group. And in case you're looking at your screen and you're thinking, I have no idea what these words mean, well, I'll tell you something. I'm not sure I know how to pronounce them. You know, my best Delhi English doesn't give me good insight on how to pronounce the Welsh words that are out there. So instead, I'm just going to tell you what those ambitions represent. And the ambitions are, the first one is that we would have healthy land, air, and water across Wales. And that just seems like a simple, maybe even trivial thing. But put it in context, only 7% of Welsh waterways are healthy today. And you got to ask the question, well, why only 7% healthy? It's because it's absolutely legal. If everybody lived by the law, we would still end up with polluted rivers because it's legal to pollute the river. The question then becomes, how do you get to a situation where the river is 100% healthy when even the law permits pollution of the river? So that requires all sorts of participants to collaborate together. Farmers with their silage and the runoff from their fields. We need to get the cities and their sewage. We need to get companies and their effluents going into the river. We just need a rethink on how all these different bits work together. So that's one. And that's the same level of scale of ambition we want to see with land, with soil and air. And we're asking another one, which is how can we reconfigure the food system across Wales so that it's optimized for the well-being of citizens and for nature, rather than what it is today, which is it's optimized for maximizing yield at lowest possible cost. And that system is delivering really poor outcomes, especially when it comes to health and so on. So is there another way to do it? Is there a way in which the hidden voices, and we define those hidden voices as twofold. One, the hidden voice of nature, because nature never gets to be at the decision table when decisions are made that impact it. And 2, future generations. Or in other words, how do you bring long-term thinking into our decision making? Those hidden voices are not present at the moment in decisions being made across government and business, and we want to see that happen. And the third one is, how do you bring community and nature into all well-being solutions across the land? So 4 ambitions. Each of these ambitions is so big that not a single one of the organizations in the Wales Transition Lab can deliver them. More than that, all 35 organizations in Wales Transition Lab can't deliver them together. The Wales Transition Lab folk plus the government can't deliver them. This is about rethinking the scale of what change could look like across Wales. And this is the starting point for then asking people, what are you going to do to make sure that your part of what you're doing in the system adheres to these 4 ambitions? So that's Wales Transition Lab. That's a start as to why we've done it and a little bit of the kind of approach we've used. But you're probably more interested in how it's happened and the challenges that we've faced. And so I'm going to invite my colleague Victoria to share her views on Wales Transition Lab. Victoria, as the lead of Wales Transition Lab, come and tell your story.
Thank you, Jyoti. Thanks for the introduction. Just checking that everybody can see me. Great, thanks. So thanks very much, Jyoti. You've run through really where we came from. I joined in with the lab in January. At that point, they'd done 1 or 2 meetings with some of the participants, and it was just really getting going. And it's been a real whirlwind of a year. Actually, it's been really useful. Let me talk about the challenges and opportunities that I've seen, being part of this project team. My background is very different to Jyoti's. Finance background, very commercial, quite different. But I did start my life with a geology degree. And I think in the last year or two, I've decided to kind of move into sustainability. It just, for me, worked really well with geology and finance together. And, for me, it's something that I really want to support going forward. And I can see all the challenges out there. And I hope that maybe bringing different ways of thinking could be beneficial. The lab has been a really good place to start that test in a place-based approach, which I find resonates with a lot of people. Jyoti, if you could move the slide to the next one, that would be useful. So, what did I find when I started in January? Now, the challenge they often have with an idea like this is, how do you get different people to the table? We had this idea that there was a problem to be solved around climate change, around health, environment. We hadn't quite defined it at that point. There were many players around Wales as a place. We felt the country of Wales has a population of 3 million. So, it's big, but it's not absolutely colossal. It's quite rural for those who are not familiar with Wales. The population is based in kind of two bands in the north of Wales and the south of Wales. And the middle is very rural, mountainous, rivers, and a lot of coastline. So it's an interesting kind of place to think about environmental impact, certainly, on the people and the population. The big challenge, is around bringing people together. Now, we had a great asset of an introducer. We had somebody, we've got a chap called Andy Middleton, who's part of North Star Transition, who is based in St David's. That's kind of in the very southwest corner of Wales. He's a big surfer. He's been in sustainability for years, knows Wales very well, knows the people of Wales very well. So he, for us, was an absolute, brilliant unlocker of getting people to the table, individuals and organizations. Now, we saw ourselves as a neutral party to bring in, public sector, charity and volunteers, sectors and businesses. And you can see from this chart is a bit of a mix of different people that we managed to bring to the table to say that we'd just like to have a discussion. We'd like to have a discussion and listen to each other of what you see the problems in Wales are. So that's how we started really the process. And again, benefit of having a partner of UCL, University College London. Now, the next slide we're looking at here is how this process now works. So I've kind of introduced this idea of we call disconnected allies, people who are, they're stakeholders, they're perhaps they are allies, but they just don't speak to each other, in everyday life. They have their silos, they work in their areas and they don't think to speak to each other. The example Jyoti gave was around the health board, and health board's not speaking to farmers, but yet healthy food being a really important part of health. So, we were seeing quite a lot of different things. We had the benefit of having UCL, the Climate Action Unit. They're a really multidisciplinary team who've helped us. They've brought us people that have behavioral psychology backgrounds, behavior change, coaching backgrounds, helped us to facilitate and put together sessions so that we can have multi-stakeholder, multidisciplinary discussions. Now, when we say people, it's all been online so far. So far, it's been online. We're starting to do one or two things where we're going to meet people in person. But since 2020, I've met Jyoti twice in person. We speak every day, but it's and we've done all this online. But we're now kind of moving to do this in person. Whether it would have worked better doing it in person or not, or quicker, it's hard to know. But I think the world we're in now, online has been really beneficial. UCL helped us design sessions where we listen. We allow people to listen, and you know, this skill of listening is not one that is very taught, well known. I sometimes, when I think about what deep listening, active listening is in a coaching context, I think it's something that maybe somebody might get from their, much loved grandmother, somebody in your family who is actually just willing to sit and listen to you, no judgment, and listen. We don't get that as something that happens for most people in their working life, in their personal life, in many ways. But I think that's what UCL brought, that discipline of allowing people to do active listening, to facilitate them to say, listen to somebody else and really think and listen and imagine yourself on their shoes. That was how we started to do things, convening people to listen. We then kind of imagined how then, based on actually listening and understanding, started to piece together the bits of, well, how does that then make, ideas of how we could maybe work together to do the right thing. But it was through that base of listening, which was the key thing. The challenges and opportunities around this whole area I found quite interesting. Sometimes you will get negative voices in a group. You'll sometimes get people with a lack of time commitment who can't commit to the whole session, who maybe dip in and out. You have a breakout room there, they dip in and out. You have some people who, I have spoken to participants who've said they have an imposter syndrome, because we do it as a very non-hierarchical, and we're often putting different people from who sit at very different rankings in organizations together in breakout rooms. And so that for some people is hard sometimes. The bit that I've found the opportunity around that is that, every hour that you spend in group work or online or in person, you have to put the work in before and after. You need to actually really understand your participants. You need to speak to them, understand where they're coming from, why they'd like to be involved, what it is, make sure you give them the space to ask the questions so you can manage expectations and get them really engaged in the process. And I think, I would say for every hour of group work, you need at least an hour of that kind of individual one-on-one minimum. And then you kind of get to know the participants a lot better. And that's been both a challenge and opportunity, because it means you get to know your participants better in the group. Your stakeholders, I've got to know the people in the Wales Transition Lab and got to understand what their organizations kind of want to get out of it, what they would like, how they'd like to support the climate change or health or well-being, whatever it is in their organization particularly that they're trying to solve. Another part of this, which is again both a challenge and opportunity, is the common language part of it. You're bringing lots of different people together, and that common language can be tricky sometimes. So we try to make sure that we're using terminology that is accessible and not jargon based. I think it's really key when you're bringing different organizations together to monitor that. That leads me nicely on to one of the key opportunities and helpful things within our approach to the Wales Transition Lab is that Wales has a unique piece of legislation. They have a legislation that was brought out in 2015 called the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act. Now, it is only valid for public sector, or they're the only organizations that have to adhere to it. But the idea is that in every decision that public sector make, they have to consider future generations, which pushes them to long-term thinking. So that, has provided a brilliant context for us in terms of the work we've done. It's underpinned very well. The challenge is where you have organizations, businesses and charities involved, and that legislation doesn't refer to them. But we have have decided that it would be a useful underpin to our approach, because long-term thinking clearly just fits very well with the aims of system change. So, we put that forward as something that kind of makes it work together. Kind of touched on before for the different kind of things that we've done to bring the Wales Transition Lab people together. But I think just in summary, how it really looks is this deep listening has been the critical kind of start part. The radical collaboration that we're trying to encourage through understanding each other better, and then ambition governance. And the idea behind that is really trying to get those agreed big ambitions and then how we govern them. Now, as Jyoti said earlier, we're 1 year in, so we're still at very early stages, but already we've had a few good wins. So very pleased about that. On this final slide, let me talk you through where we're at the moment. We have the 4 ambitions we've come up with. We have a process, and where we're at now is we've got a few different projects we're now working on with individual stakeholders within the lab, which has been really great. It's all around, we've recently engaged with one of the health boards within Wales to help them on a piece of work to really start to imagine food and the impact on well-being and optimizing well-being and health through food, something that just they wouldn't have thought about before being part of the Wales Transition Lab. So that's one project that's very active, and we've been asked to help them with a 4-month feasibility study, which will include continuing the work of the lab and engaging the other participants, asking questions, getting understanding and localized, what are the problems we need to solve to help this. We have another project as well that's kind of evolved out of the lab, which is around one of the kind of public procurement, again, in the health service, want to look at a community-led procurement model, where at the moment, most of the hospital food in Wales is actually bought externally and from the rest of the UK and is not actually grown or processed in Wales. So they feel that they perhaps could be part of a solution in doing that. So they've asked us to partner with them in helping them develop that. So we're seeing a few different projects. There are 2 kind of around the food area. We have another business has come to us. Mock McDonald has asked us to help them with around a digital infrastructure type tool that could support some of the work. So we've got a few different little projects that are kind of coming out of this lab, different ideas. We're kind of the central point, bringing that together and trying to look for funding to help funding. Wales have been very good, the government have been very supportive. And at the moment, it's all looking at seed funding, it's feasibility studies, it's pilots, it's that kind of level. And the opportunity for us is to work with the different stakeholders, but also bring in others, bring in more. That's the opportunity we have to engage, keep all the other Wales Transition Lab participants informed, communicate, and keep the door open for others as we go along. The next big challenge will be, the bigger funding piece after the initial feasibility studies. But even within a year, we're making those steps of getting a few different projects off the ground, which is great. And we're getting real engagement with the participants. Where I see the benefits of the lab and just having people speak to each other, I think I see that we brought confidence to some of the participants that they can do something, they can act, they can be an actor, a change agent. We're helping them with the ability and their confidence, to do these things. So, I hope that we can support their capability to do this. I think being part of the Wales Transition Lab, we're there as a catalyst. There's all these amazing organizations, lots of things happening already, but by being there and hand-holding and supporting collaboration, I really feel as if things are moving ahead. And I think sometimes that's missing in some areas where there's loads of projects, but there's just not that little catalyst to gently support and guide and help along and listen. I think that's the key lesson, I would say. But I hope that's pretty much my slides, and I'll be passing to Jenny. We'll explain a little bit more about how the policy feeds into that. But thank you.
Thanks very much, Victoria. So my name's Jenny Scott, and as we said, my background is more around, my first love is economics. I trained as an economist, started at the Bank of England, and then got into communications. And I love the meld of using communications to effect change with an economic structure behind it. So what I'm going to talk a little bit about is about why and how, in our experience with the Wales Transition Lab, that focusing on this bottom-up approach that Victoria talked about, the convening, the listening, the getting to know people at a really local level, sits alongside the top-down approach. Again, Victoria mentioned the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act as a critical piece of legislation that has given us a platform to do what we're doing. So combining those two approaches, the top-down, the bottom-up, we're that sort of hub in the middle that Victoria talked about. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how that works. And first of all, draw a little bit on the theory of why that approach can be effective only under certain conditions, and then try to bring in some real world examples. And I'm afraid the bulk of my examples do draw on my time in central banking and macroeconomic policy making and regulation, and the part that that can play in incentivizing change. So in my experience, just very broadly, affecting change is very difficult, as Jyoti alluded to at the beginning there. That's the bit where we're at now with climate change. The case has been made pretty effectively. The public are increasingly on board. Now we have to translate those commitments at the country level, at the organization level, into actual activations that work. We effectively need to enter that farm gate. And that's the challenge that we're finding ourselves in now. And that's why Wales Transition Lab was born. Just to take one more step back, I would argue that on a macro scale, you need at least two conditions to be satisfied for effective change. From my experience as a policymaker and a regulator, there needs to be a framework in place, an institution, something that enables regulation that enables and incentivizes change, a sort of plumbing, if you like. And that's my background at the Bank of England. But there does also need to be a cultural piece in place and a will to do things, I think. So we had all the rules and regulations around the financial sector, and it still didn't prevent the financial crisis, the financial crisis, because I think a lot of energy was expended on getting around the rules. So it doesn't always lead to the right outcomes, the box ticking. But equally, if the culture and the will is there to change, but there's no plumbing or framework that makes it easy to enact change, then enthusiasm can fall and change falls by the wayside. So I do think you need both. And I think there's a plausible analogy there as well with the top down and bottom up. So I think you probably need the top down, some government target setting, or maybe fund provision, or maybe that, like the legislation that Victoria mentioned, but on its own, it's not as effective as it could be without the on-the-ground knowledge of the particular problems or the possible solutions. I think taking a purist approach from either end is probably likely to end in failure. But joining up those two is challenging. As Victoria talked about, you can have the project that we're working on where we're trying to help one of the health authorities change the food procurement rules to get more local involvement in food provision in the health service. But you can't just have the farmers turn on a tap and divert all of their resources into the local health authority, because they've got contracts that need satisfying elsewhere. So you also need that change to happen at the local level if you're going to enact the systemic change. So from my observations, I think there are at least two reasons for thinking that this bottom-up policy generation can produce a better outcome when combined with the top-down than purely the top-down. I think if you look at the bottom-up and the approach that we've taken with the Wales Transition Lab and the active listening and so forth, you're more likely to end up with tailored local policy solutions that could therefore produce better outcomes than a one-size-fits-all. But I would put a caveat into that it partly depends on whether there are genuinely bespoke solutions and lots of different multiple and bespoke policy levers that you can pull. And in the case of climate, I think that's probably there. But if you take the other extreme, in the case of macroeconomic policy making, I think that's where the limitations come in. So for example, again, drawing on my experience at the Bank of England, we had a low stable inflation target of 2%, and effectively one tool to implement that interest rate. I mean, you could argue that QE is another tool, but it's a pretty blunt tool. It applies across the whole country. It's not conducive to local differentiation. You can't have regional interest rates. So there are limits to the bottom-up approach that you can take. I think there are, You could debate whether there are policy levers in a central bank that have more localized potential, such as macro potential tools around restricting high loan to value mortgage targets, around house price bubbles and so forth. But without veering into industrial policy, I think those tools are limited. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to rattle on. The second, I think, reason for thinking that bottom-up policy generation, when combined with top-down, can produce a better outcome and systemic change, is that even if there aren't these bespoke local policy solutions, it might still be the case that the success of a top-down policy requires a lot of community mobilization. So to take a 40-year-old study, Ritter and Webber's approach, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, to wicked problems, I just sort of picked out one of their quotes. It talks about needing a collaborative approach to make those people who are being affected into participants of the planning process. They are not merely asked, but actively involved in that planning process, which I think beautifully sums up the approach that we've been taking to the Wales Transition Lab, which is taking the people who are affected by climate change and by the policies that are done at the macro level, bringing them into this planning process and enabling them, giving them the platform to co-create the solutions. Again, drawing on my experience at the bank did try to dip a toe into the water here. We introduced citizens panels, an online economy hub, community and youth forums, but they were primarily designed to listen to what people think. I think it's very hard to turn those into proper bottom-up initiatives when you're talking about the macro economy. So as I said before, I think this combination of the bottom-up and the top-down works best when you have multiple bespoke policy levers. I think even if you do have, one of the other caveats to put in place, I think, again, from my experience and in sort of on the periphery of government policy making, is that you do still need a government to either relinquish a little bit of control to the local level or to rethink how they engage with the private and third sectors. And obviously governments have different appetites for that. But on the whole, my experience in this country is that the government hasn't been particularly open or built to doing that, relinquishing the control centrally to maybe mayors, which over here we've introduced a system of leaders in large city centres, but often those leaders are of a different political stripe than the central government. So there's little incentive for the central government to relinquish control and money to a city leader from a different political party who can then claim the credit for the policies. So there's a little bit of politics that goes on. One of the other, just to briefly mention, one of the other labs that we're also looking at is a finance transition lab. I think that is trickier because whilst the Wales Transition Lab does have these multiple bespoke policy levers at the local level, the Finance Transition Lab, you do have to take into account regulation before you even get started. So I think that probably is a little bit more challenging, although we have had a number of dialogues with a number of participants, which we can certainly talk about if there's any interest in that. But just to wrap up, I think North Star Transition is not about getting as much money as possible from central government and then spending it on the ground in a possibly ring-fenced, prescribed way. It's about defining the policy from multiple local perspectives, from the perspective of actual people who actually experience these problems, and then co-creating the solution, and then laddering it back up to use the levers, the structures, the frameworks that might exist at a more centralized level to bring about that change. And if those levers don't exist, then you have to make the case for them. And in the case of the Wales Transition Lab, a micro example of that might be how the Health Authority in Wales is now going to try and use their food procurement budget to source more food locally. That's a sort of the more top-down end, meeting the farmers coming from the bottom-up end. So I'll leave it there, conscious I've rattled through it, but my part was the more theoretical part, which is probably the less interesting part than the on-the-ground part.
Thanks very much, Jyoti, Victoria, and Jenny. Let me get the ball rolling by ask if whether Anne or Jay have questions.
I'm happy to start, and Jay, unless you'd like to. So a quick question is, I was really intrigued by this idea of deep listening and the kind of skills that you have to build for people to be able to participate in the kinds of initiatives that you're talking about. It is a skill that is essentially never taught. I have seen people try to teach it. It gets talked about a lot, but it's more of a counseling kind of thing or a coaching kind of thing, as opposed to a problem solving kind of thing. And I wonder if you could talk us through a little bit about how do you do that, especially if you're starting with a bunch of policymakers having to listen to a bunch of farmers or not the kind of people that they normally deeply listen to. How does that work in practice?
I guess I could have a first go. One of the challenges with listening is that every time we're listening, we're usually thinking about what we're going to say next, or we're listening to the idea to see, does it fit in with my mindset on this? Or does it help me take my story forward? Or do I completely disagree with this? It's always about what am I hearing and how am I reacting to it? So we have to find a way in which we can take the us, the me out of it, the I and the me out of it. And so if you and I are listening, one of the exercises we have done quite a lot in Wales Transition Lab and also in this other lab that Jenny mentioned, which is the Finance Transition Lab. So if Anne, you and I are listening to each other, first of all, you might speak to me, and my task is to listen to you. And I'm there just to listen to you. I can ask you questions about your ideas. I can test your ideas, but there's a really good reason why I need to listen well. Because when it's time for your idea to be taken out and shared with somebody else, it's not going to be you doing it. It's going to be me doing it. So I need to get to a place where I understand your idea well enough to be a credible exponent of your idea, to take it forward. And I'm not bringing my baggage to it, because at the end of the day, I'm not proud about the idea or protective about the idea, because it was never my idea anyway. It's somebody else's idea. And that's one such tool that we've used, where it creates the opportunity for people to listen, but to listen without bringing their own baggage into play, but to allow them to hear, to really listen, and then be prepared to share the ideas they've listened. So it's not enough to listen. You've got to be able to absorb the ideas well enough that you could then share those ideas with somebody else. So that's one example of a tool. Does that help you see how it's not as theoretical? And actually, perhaps it's just simply a pragmatic approach to getting people to engage with each other.
I can think of a lot of contexts where that would be really, really useful, not just in the context of these kind of transition labs.
Jay.
So I was struck by one thing you said in some of the opening about the rivers. And one of the, talking about the health of the rivers, one of the things you said is that it was not illegal to pollute the rivers, at least in some places. And you talked about the need to bring community together and to get as many stakeholders as possible to understand. And I guess it struck me, and perhaps because of an analogy to climate change more broadly, of when is it that what we need to do is bring everyone together and change people's approach to things broadly? And when is it sometimes just that we need different rules, that it needs to be illegal to pollute the river? And the analogy to climate being, we can all make better choices, and we should, and it's important to help people make better choices. But there are times where you also need to change the rules and change the incentives to try to trigger a broader change. And so, how do you see that? And it's not necessarily a tension, because they can go hand in hand, but how do you see that comparison?
So let's look at a really practical example. Let's say that you're the water company, and you've got to get the water to be healthy enough for the users downstream. However, you know that there's phosphorus getting into the river, because there's runoff from the farm. So the farmer's not intentionally putting the phosphorus into the rivers, but they're using phosphorus as part of their chemical package that they're putting into their soils. That is causing a runoff, and that runoff is going into the rivers. What do you do about it? Now, the engineering solution would be to say, well, we just have to put more processing in so that we get the water to be cleaner. And kind of that's the approach we use when we face a problem. The waters are rising. What do? We build a wall, and ideally the wall is high enough that the rising water level doesn't breach the wall, and that protects us from flooding. But there comes a point where that kind of approach falls down, either because the levels of water continue to rise and then they go over the wall, or the levees break and then you get a flood. So the engineering solution of dealing with phosphorus in the water may not necessarily be the best one. And also it's probably quite an expensive one. And the entire cost for that will be borne by the water company. So is there another way to do it? Well, perhaps if we thought about the fact that maybe the farmers might use a different method of farming, which moves them more towards, say, agroecological methods or organic types of methods. Maybe they have meadow margins by their fields. Those meadow margins are part of the agroecological approach, but also the meadow margins can pick up the runoff from the field so that the phosphorus isn't getting into the thing. You also get the added benefit that maybe the soil holds water better, and maybe you've also got a carbon retention opportunity, it's a carbon sequestration opportunity, because the soil that is holding water better also holds carbon better. And so you put all of those packages together and suddenly you've got a change with farming practice, you've got biodiversity rise, you've got maybe carbon sequestration going on, you've got cleaner water, and all kinds of different participants in the system could be interested in how that works. So it's no longer just the water company's problem to fix the river. It's in everybody's interest to do that. But we're not constructed in a way that allows these different participants to collaborate together at the moment. So we've got to find a mechanism that allows them to get together to see the sense of a shared collaboration around it, and then to align their actions so that those aligned actions enable something positive to happen. So that's the kind of example I'd give you as to how a kind of one-dimensional single point solution might actually not be adequate, and a richer multi-stakeholder, multi-collaboration opportunity can create a much better result for everybody.
I wondered, Jyoti, if one way to put this is rules are solutions to well-defined problems. And it sounds like what you're saying is that if you're going to be talking about the systemic kind of problems we have, you can't really do a clear definition of the problem up front. I mean, you might have a very broad definition of we want greater sustainability, but that's not a problem about which you can make a specific rule. So that maybe the kind of situation that lends itself to very explicit rules is a situation where a problem is well-defined and relatively easy to understand. And then you can say, you just can't do X, or possibly use that as a leverage point to try to tip a system. Am I reading you right?
Well, I think it's really interesting, because if you're going to start this kind of approach, one, you can't go in with a fixed idea of what the question is that you're seeking to address, because that question actually emerges out of the collaboration of folks. You also can't go in with a clear idea of what the solution is going to be, because you have no idea what the solution might be. I'll give you an example from, Victoria mentioned the food procurement idea that we're exploring with the National Health Service hospitals in Wales. The finance professional who was sitting in the Wales Transition Lab was listening to farmers talking about their viability issues and thinking, what's this got to do with me? He'd never been in a room with farmers before. He's listening to medical doctors who are probably closer to his sphere of influence, but medical doctors saying that the food people were eating across the population was causing huge crises. And yet, he'd never talked to the doctors either. But he was the guy spending the money on these issues. And he's thinking, so this has something to do with me, but what am I going to do about it? And then when he went away to explore it, he found that NHS Wales, the National Health Service in Wales, spends £20 million a year on buying food for its hospital inpatients. And guess how much of that food gets spent, how much of that money gets spent in Wales? 0%. Nothing gets spent in Wales because Wales is a high-cost economy when it comes to food, and so the National Health Service buys the cheapest food it can buy that meets certain quality standards, and that food comes from elsewhere. So then he's beginning to see the world differently, which is he's meeting farmers who are in crisis. He's hearing doctors talking about food problems. He's seeing for himself that the medical service in Wales is spending £7 billion a year on mental health services, and farmers are contributing a huge proportion to that. And the wheels are beginning to turn because now he can see there's a connection here. And so he now asks himself the question, what would change if we could spend that 20 million locally with farmers so that they don't have the same viability problems, or at least we're beginning to start getting involved in this in a different way. And if they don't have the viability problems, does it mean they won't have the mental health issues? Will we see as many farmer suicides? No one knows the answers to these questions. You can't start with saying that's our goal, is that we're going to change farmer suicides, but can you integrate food, health, nature? And that's the starting point. The idea of localizing food sourcing would never have happened without getting the farmers and the doctors and the accountants and so on to all be in the same room and begin to share their experience.
So can I ask a related question to what we're just discussing? It's that you've talked about bringing people together to collaborate, to listen, to collaborate. What is the role of technology? I would have thought that now with the kinds of technologies that are available, it would be much easier to keep everyone apprised of what is going on and what the other views are. Or do you have to segment them in certain ways because otherwise you never get very far on particular issues? But what's the role technology can play here?
So I'll have a first go, but I know Victoria will also be ready to jump in. So I think technology and information is a critical factor here. And I see this happening at kind of three levels. One, the people who have never connected with each other, these disconnected stakeholders, their information sets have never connected with each other. So the people who are in the health sector have got all the data on the health problems going wrong, but they have no connection with the farmers and the food. Where's the food coming from and what are the food challenges and so on and so forth. So how do we bring those information sets together? And why is it important to bring those information sets together? Because if you want the health guy to make a decision that's going to help the farmer, then they need information about where the cross opportunities are. They need information that helps them decide that it's well worth doing something that they hadn't done before. So I see that there is a need for data sharing and information sharing at a scale we have never seen before. But this needs to be focused on the possible actions that people can take so that those actions can be aligned with each other. But two, we also need to just find a way in which it's possible for people to explore how the system is configured. And that configuration can sometimes be captured easily in an online setup than it is to actually try and just make sense of the complex collaborations that could be taking place. So we need to find ways in which the interactions of the system can be captured electronically, and people talk about digital twins in that context. But 3, you also need tools that enable disconnected stakeholders in the system to actually just engage, just learn about each other and so on. So I think there are multiple levels at which technology can help, but Victoria might want to talk about the project that we are actually exploring with Mark MacDonald.
Well, indeed, thanks, Jyoti. Yeah, it's a good question, Sunil, about technology. I sometimes think that sometimes keeping it simple has been really useful in terms of just the project itself, and building those relationships, just using the basics of communication. But in terms of the actual project that we've been considering doing with supporting Mark MacDonald around providing a neutral space for data, because all organizations do hold data, but how do you provide a place for that data where you need to put it together? Now, we're still navigating how all that works in terms of, IP rules, various things that will come in time, but just it will be very, very significant if we can manage to get health data against growing data, against, environmental quality data. That will be very powerful if we can start to see those interactions in a data sense as well. So we definitely see that working in parallel with people and how they think the complexity will work as well. So we see that very much working side by side.
Let me ask participants to keep putting their questions in the Q&A, let me ask another question. This is related to what you're just saying. So we're trying to bring people together. We're trying to listen to them. We're trying to, in some sense, engender collaboration. But this is likely to be a long, drawn-out process, right? So in some sense, we have to keep them engaged for an extended period of time during a transition which is likely to be disruptive, right? And so to keep the engagement, the question arises, and this not just in this particular project, but I think it's a much more generic question in the sense that how do you assess and measure systemic change? How do we convey to people that we're slowly moving forward, that there is success down the horizon, that there's going to be pain now, there's going to be disruption, but there is something to be gained by doing this. Have you thought about that, or does that become a challenge when some people get dispirited or they don't see that their ideas are being taken into consideration? So how do you keep what I'm trying to say, how do you keep it all on track? Because you need these diverse perspectives and stakeholders to keep on track. So how do you measure success? How do you communicate it? How do you keep it on track?
I might tackle that one if I may. I think one of the first things we've tried to do is really, really outline that this is very long term. This is not, most people are used to signing up to a project that is 1-2 years long, 3 years long. We've all initially outlined that this is something that we imagine it being 10, 15, 20 years. And we're not clearly expecting full engagement, the whole time of that at all. So, they will be, it's acceptable to dip in, dip out. That's where we've set it up. We want to be open and we want to keep it moving. We haven't quite got to measurement yet. That's actually where we're just kind of moving now and considering, how do we measure the balance of collaboration, the benefit of collaboration, how do we do that? And we're starting to think about that because I think it is important. I'm an accountant, so I do like to measure stuff. So I think that's the next stage of the project for us. Jyoti, have you got any thoughts?
I was just going to say, Victoria, just to build on that slightly with the example of the Finance Transition Lab, I think it's a particular challenge in that because with Wales Transition Lab, there's something so tangible, isn't there, about a farmer producing food, or a patient being in a hospital, or a child being educated in school, which sometimes with the Finance Transition Lab is a little bit harder to grasp, because the outcomes are even more sort of nebulous and one removed from the real world. So I'm finding that a real challenge in that lab. And I think we've had, what is it, Jyoti? I think it's 3 dialogues so far, with up to about 70 participants, which is a lot more than we ever expected. And they come from across, we've got buy side, sell side, asset managers, insurance sector people, all sorts of people who are coming at it from all sorts of different perspectives. And one of the early lessons I think we're learning there is first of all, it's not hierarchical. So these people come to the lab as themselves, in a sense. They've got their institution behind them, but as Victoria said earlier, you're put into an active listening room with someone who might be very, very senior to you, or very, very junior, but there is no hierarchy. Absolutely everybody's opinion is valid. And I think that's one thing that keeps people coming back, because it's an area where people love to be listened to, and it is an area where you do genuinely feel listened to. So that's actually really helpful. And then also we do slightly piggyback off the Wales Transition Lab, because we can send, in the emails that we use to update people, we can point them to these tangible outcomes that are beginning to bubble up in the Wales Transition Lab, to say, we don't know where this Finance Transition Lab is going, because the whole point of it is that it's emergent and that we are co-creating this. So we can't tell you where it's going, but we can tell you that the process that we're developing yields results. And here's an example of that over here. And here's how we've brought in some of the policymakers and working alongside them. And I think those little stepping stones, because I think you're absolutely right. If you cast out to some mythical endpoint in 20 years' time, everyone's just going to pack up and go home. It's just never going to keep you at the table. Whereas if you can just pepper it with these little stepping stones that take you to the next little bit, and then the next little bit, that's, as you say, we're co-creating this as we go. So that's kind of, I think, unless Jyoti, and if you want to build on that, but that's sort of where we've got to with the Finance Transition Lab.
I think for me, one of the interesting challenges about measurement of the performance of this kind of system is that we are in a state where we have no idea how we can do this properly, and we're still learning. And so I would also say we have no idea how we can measure it. But we know that if people don't walk with us on this journey, then that's an immediate no-no, that we're not actually delivering anything. Whereas what we've seen in Wales is we started with nearly a dozen people just for the initial conversation. We had no idea where it was going to go. And we now have 35 organizations collaborating with us. And so over a period of a year, that's the engagement. Now, some of those organizations are more deeply connected with us. And because they're willing to step forward and do some stuff, to me, that feels like, okay, some people really get it and are willing to do something about it. Others are interested, but we haven't got to the point where they're actually that committed to carrying out some actions, but they're probably looking on at the others who are doing some stuff to say, okay, so how will they fare? Now, 10 years ago, I got involved in the process of exploring how to change corporate reporting. And if you'd asked us at that time, what would the goal be? We had no idea. We were simply saying, we think corporate reporting needs to change, but how should it change? What should it change to? No idea. But that started a journey where today we've now got a new reporting framework. Well, it wasn't today, it was 7 years ago that a new reporting framework came out called integrated reporting, which sought to address some of the limitations of the financial reporting model. And along the way, 2,500 listed corporations are using it. And last week at COP26, there was an announcement that integrated reporting was going to be wrapped up with the Climate Disclosure Standards Board and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board into a new International Sustainability Standards Board run by the IFRS. So it's interesting to watch that journey, because it was certainly not the intention at the start to create something like that, but that is how it has grown. And it's because people are willing to participate that you want to press forward and say, okay, let's go and do something about it. And I look at some of the questions that are coming up on the chat, and it's kind of the same issue. There's a question from Stephen that says transformation takes time, it takes decades. However, most of the wicked problems like climate change require very fast action. Does your model have a framework for acceleration in such cases? Well, you know what, our model is a developing model. We're learning as we go along. What we have found is that our practice of the model hasn't said to us, this doesn't work. And we're going to explore how our practice of the model is going to help us develop ideas around how we can accelerate it. But I think the bigger idea in the model is simply, how do you connect people together? How do you get them to create actions that will help each other? And when I look at the physical world, I was reading this account in Nature magazine where climatologists were saying, the biggest driver for climate change is actually going to be deforestation of the Amazon. And that deforestation in the Amazon will cause a change in the circulation above the Atlantic, which will change the Gulf Stream, which will cause the melting of the ice caps, which in turn will cause changes in the boreal forests across North America. And you'll see permafrost melting in Siberia and the release of methane, et cetera, et cetera. Each action results in another action, which causes a change in the system equilibrium. And we're going to see these actions following one on top of the other. And the scientists see that those sort of tipping points take place because we live in a deeply connected physical world. And for me, the really interesting question is, when we live in such a deeply interconnected social, human, economic world, are there positive actions we can take which allow the same kind of tipping point stuff to happen, but in social tipping point terms? Are there positive actions that feed other positive actions that feed other positive actions? So that's the real challenge that we're looking at. And I can't tell you what the timeline is going to look like on it. And it could be that we're all too late anyway. We're probably stuffed when it comes to the 1.5 degree centigrade heating challenge. But are there things we can do to begin the transformation of the system that actually gets us to a place where we can do this stuff better? I think that's the place that I'm at.
So Jay, you had a question.
Yeah, I was curious about one thing. In the conversation around food and local food in particular, there's one part of me that listens to it, and I very much understand what you're saying, and I think there are huge advantages to local food and things like this. The flip side, the international economist in me sometimes worries, right, that the first great trade economist was effectively arguing against agricultural protection in Britain, Ricardo arguing against the Corn Laws. And in general, I do think that, we all have a much higher standard of living due to our ability to trade and to focus on comparative advantages and things like that. And so how do you separate out kind of thinking about the advantages of, redirecting some funds towards local farmers and things like that without it kind of cascading down towards saying, you know what, let's just go for self-sufficiency within the United Kingdom and quit importing anything, right? Like, I'm not saying it's a slippery slope all the way to there, but how do you find the lines where you see things on one side versus another?
Well, Jenny's the economist in our group, but I'll tell you this. It's I went to the same grad school as Sunil did, but we probably ended up with completely different views on economics. I'm at the place where I largely regret the fact that I trained as an economist, and I'll tell you why. Because in my training, I was basically encouraged to think about factor A and factor B are interacting with each other. And when factor A and factor B interact, we can construct a beautiful model that tells us what the function is that represents that interaction. And everything else remains the same. It remains constant. So we're just exploring the shift in those two factors. When you look at how ecologists look at the world, they look at factor A and say, oh, factor A changed. Wow, what else changed? Well, not just B, but C and D and E and F and everything else changed as well. So we're not in the world where we're simply trying to capture the interaction between A and B. We're looking at how one change impacts all sorts of other things. And because as economists, we can simply say we're ignoring those other factors, we end up with externalities. So let me address your particular food question with this thing that I heard. The medical people saying to me, because I went to ask them, does it matter if we're going to buy cheap food from America? And the particular emotive question was chlorinated chicken. You know, we out here in Europe, we don't buy chlorinated chicken. It's not even, I don't believe it's legal across the EU. Now that Britain is not part of the EU, the question is, should we buy chlorinated chicken? And some people would say, of course we should buy chlorinated chicken, it's cheap. It's you know, Americans eat it, so there can't be a problem with it. It should be fine. And another part say, absolutely no, we don't want any of that stuff. And we don't think it's a good idea. So now you bring into that conversation. So I went to have this discussion about chlorinated chicken with the health professionals, and they were like, we don't know the answer to that. However, when I was discussing with them the possibility that the farmers would go bust because of the cheap food coming in, their question to me was this: are we going to do to the farmers what we did to the miners? And what they mean by that is Wales was one of the first places in the world to have a successful coal mining industry. And the Industrial Revolution started in the United Kingdom, and you know, coal energy from Wales was part of that. It's now part of the climate problem that we have around the world. But that was you know, started right there. And then those miners, those mines were shut down as they weren't profitable anymore. So what happened to the miners? The assumption was other industries would pick them up and run with them. But what the health professional that I was speaking to last year, so we're talking probably about June, July 2020, and remember, we were right in the heart of a pandemic at that point. And this is, he was listening to me saying, maybe these farmers are going to go bust because we will be buying cheap food elsewhere. And his answer to me was this: are we going to do to those farmers what we did to the miners? Because right now in the UK, the hottest hotspot for COVID are the mining communities, where for 2 generations, they've had 0 job prospects. They've had 0, their food quality has been really poor. They've had alcohol abuse problems. They've had substance abuse problems. And in that environment, COVID raced around like wildfire. So the end result of putting all those pieces together is that, yes, there is an international environment in which trade works really well. It supports positive outcomes, but there are also externalities that get hidden away. And the costs of those externalities are huge. And we don't see them on the same balance sheets usually, because we found ways to hide them. And the UN Food Summit from last year said that basically the costs of food as we have it at the moment, would be more than doubled if we introduce the social and environmental costs associated with the way we do food today. So is there a right way to do food? There is a cheap way to do food. Is it the right way to do food? Is there another way? So I'm sorry, it's a long answer. It's a non-professional economist answer. And yeah, Ricardo did what he did, but I suspect Ricardo was thinking of factor A and factor B and what's the best outcome there. But how do you bring in the raft of human and social experience into that as well? I think that's the challenge we face. And that's the carbon problem, that's the biodiversity problem, all of them wrapped up with exactly that same assessment.
I think we've run out of time. So if there are any last thoughts from the three of you, can we be very, very brief? Because what I've heard is that, when Anna and I wrote the article on reckoning with systemic hazards, we had talked about some guiding principles of decision-making when you're dealing with systemic issues. And there it was, we talked about resilience. We talked about, resilience as dynamic robustness. We talked about multi-layered governance that you guys have spoken to. We spoke about empowered self-organization, which was the bottom-up, that you can't just be top-down, it has to be bottom-up. And you talked about convening top-down and bottom-up. Communication, we said was key to maintain public support, social support for an extended period of time. And that was one of the questions somebody asked. And I think you answered that. And the last was basically the horizon, that typically we tend to be very short-term, and that how do you maintain a long horizon focus? And you mentioned the Wales legislation, which is forcing public policy to actually think long-term, think about nature, to think about future generations. So I think that what you guys are doing is absolutely fascinating. And this is the kind of conversations that I think we'll need to have much more of if you're going to solve the problems of a very, very complex economic, social, political system. And that it's not going to be easy, especially if we have to accelerate some of these forces given the climate crisis that we're facing. So anyway, some last thoughts from the three of you. What do you think you would do differently a year now, given you started a year ago? What would you do differently today after learning or going through this process for a year? Briefly.
It's a very good question. Very good. I'm sure there'll be a few little bits and pieces along the way, but I think, generally, just getting involved, getting engagement, trying to support people to have confidence to move to action, has just been really useful in whatever way that is. I think sometimes, like for me, the food system has been a really interesting one. I think it brings things together very well, and it's a very, very good common language. So for me, I think food system change in this is a real good key for conversations across the board. So I think, yeah, changes, maybe I would have learned more about the food system earlier on this year, is my answer.
Jenny?
I think I'll leave the last word to you, Jyoti. Yes, I was going to say, I think one thing that it's opened my eyes to, and this is through our collaboration with University College London and the Climate Action Unit, is that action leads to belief. I, as a economist and communicator, I always thought that you've just got to persuade people, get them to believe, and then they'll do something. What this lab work has taught me is that you need to take the step, you need to create the ripple, and then you don't know where the ripple ends up. Because if you don't actually do anything and see the impact of what you're doing, you're really going to struggle to truly believe that you can change things. So at the risk of getting sort of slightly philosophical, I would say that I would encourage more people to take action which leads to the belief, rather than trying to have the full information set, look at it from all angles, come up with absolutely the right perfect solution because I believe that is, and then do something. So I'd flip it round.
Jyoti.
I guess for me, the exciting thing has been what Victoria called ambition governance, which is if you set an ambition that's so high that people don't feel compromised in thinking about their jobs in just conventional, normal terms, but they're willing to say, oh my goodness, that's a really high ambition, but it's worth going after. Now what can I do? I think that's really exciting. And so I want to see what we can do to set ambitions really high. I suspect our politicians are not the ones who will set high ambitions. It's not the experts who will do it. It's people who, when they learn about each other and our challenges, we're the ones who will set high expectations and high ambitions. And that's what I want to go after.
Okay, thanks very much. I think we've run out of time. And it was absolutely a fascinating discussion. And I think that in many ways you are adopting a complex adaptive philosophy towards looking at the world, and not just in terms of narrow sectoral or even intellectual perspectives. So I thank you very much for a fascinating discussion, and I bid good morning, good evening, good night to people from around the world, and please join us again, and we'll be back on the air, if not in December, again in January. Thanks very much.